Hello, my name is Francesca Federico, and I am a misinformation analyst at Cybots Incorporated. I'm also a senior at the University of California, Berkeley, as well as a student investigator at UC Berkeley's Law School's Human Rights Center, an open source intelligence analyst for Amnesty International's Digital Verification Corps, and a digital Sherlock at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Research Lab. So before I begin, I would like to take the time to thank the organization and all the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present to all of you today. Over the next 15 minutes, I will be explaining the role and the magnitude of COVID-19 vaccine misinformation and the threats that misinformation poses to not only our global society, but specifically to the science community. My presentation will begin with some background and introduction on my abstract and the data collected. We will then discuss and differentiate between misinformation and disinformation. Next, I will share my findings and progress on an ongoing COVID-19 vaccination misinformation survey for adults ages 18 to 23. And lastly, I will lay out next steps to be taken. So to begin our story of how misinformation can pose a threat to successful vaccination of young adults, specifically ages 18 to 23, let's look into current vaccination rates per state. Here we have an infographic from the CDC that pertains to the percentage of the population that has been vaccinated state by state. As you can see, there's a clear lack of uniformity. So while investigating these rates, I began to question whether or not misinformation on social media platforms might be playing a role in this lack of uniformity and willingness to become vaccinated. So now in order to understand the magnitude of the misinformation narrative surrounding COVID-19 vaccines, we must first understand and differentiate between misinformation and disinformation. As defined by the groundbreaking Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Research Lab, misinformation can be understood as false information or out of context claims that are presented regardless of the intent to deceive. Contrarily, disinformation can be defined as false or misleading information that is spread with the intention to deceive. So in order to contextualize the differences between mis and disinformation in the case of COVID-19 vaccines, it might be easier to think of it as follows. Although many young adults, ages 18 to 23, that we surveyed, might not be the perpetrators of spreading disinformation, they might be unintentionally spreading misinformation through social media posts or even word of mouth. And it is important to acknowledge that both mis and disinformation are playing into the current infodemic surrounding COVID-19 vaccines. So with this understanding of misinformation versus disinformation, we are able to move forward and acknowledge the magnitude of circulation of misinformation. So the magnitude of circulation of misinformation has been studied by many researchers, and a recent MIT study learned that humans, not bots, are primarily responsible for the spreading of false and misleading information. The MIT study also found that a false story is shared and circulated at a rate that is 6 times faster than a story that is true. So to test my hypothesis that social media misinformation poses a threat to the successful vaccination among adults ages 18 to 23, I created and conducted a survey pertaining to popular misinformation claims surrounding the COVID-19 vaccines. This is an ongoing survey, but it has already circulated through 30 different universities across the country. Here you will see a geographic distribution of universities of the students that took part in the survey, as well as a list of the specific names of the universities listed, and they're listed below. I'll give you a second to look at them. So to begin our anonymous survey, students were asked, which of the following claims regarding the COVID-19 vaccine have you heard? So our students, remember they're adults ages 18 to 23, 144 students answered COVID-19 vaccines are completely safe. 196 students answered that COVID-19 vaccines are effective. 76 students responded that it is better to catch COVID than to get vaccinated. And a mere 4 students said that they have not heard any of these claims. So the purpose of this first question was trying to get an initial glimpse into students' views towards the COVID-19 vaccine. Following that question, students were asked the same question which of the following claims regarding the COVID-19 vaccine have you heard? But this time, the options were pertaining to specific pieces of misinformation that have been widely circulated on social media platforms. So to this question, 108 adults ages 18 to 23 responded that they had heard the claim, the COVID vaccine affects fertility. 32 adults responded that they had heard the claim, some people die immediately when receiving the COVID-19 vaccine. And 40 adults responded that they had heard the claim, Bill Gates paid $1.4 billion to put microchips into the vaccine. 72 adults responded that they had heard the claim the COVID vaccine injects you with dead coronavirus. And lastly, 64 adults responded that they had not heard any of these claims. So the relevance of asking whether or not adults ages 18 to 23 have simply heard of these claims of misinformation is to exemplify the magnitude of circulation of misinformation and how, regardless of whether respondents believe these pieces of misinformation or not, these false and misleading claims are in fact being widely circulated. So following those two questions, the students were then asked if these claims regarding the COVID vaccine were to be applied to certain vaccines. So this question, which of the following claims applied to the Pfizer vaccine specifically? So the results were as follows. 64 students answered that the claim the COVID vaccine affects fertility applied to the Pfizer vaccine. 20 students answered that the claim some people die immediately when receiving the COVID-19 vaccine applied to the Pfizer vaccine. 12 students responded that the claim Bill Gates paid $1.4 billion to put microchips into the vaccine applied to the Pfizer vaccine. 36 students responded that the claim the COVID vaccine injects you with dead coronavirus applied to the Pfizer vaccine. And lastly, 84 students responded that they do not believe any of these claims and therefore none of them apply to the Pfizer vaccine. Next, students were asked whether or not these claims pertain to the Moderna vaccine. 48 students answered that the claim COVID vaccine affects fertility did in fact apply to the Moderna vaccine. 20 students answered that the claim some people die immediately when receiving the COVID-19 vaccine applied to the Moderna vaccine. 12 students responded that the claim Bill Gates paid $1.4 billion to put microchips into the vaccine applied to the Moderna vaccine. And 28 students responded that the claim the COVID vaccine injects you with dead coronavirus applied to the Moderna vaccine. And lastly, 92 students responded that they do not believe any of these claims and therefore none of them applied to the Moderna vaccine. Following the questions from Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, students were asked to consider whether or not these same claims apply to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. 44 students answered that the claim COVID vaccine affects fertility did in fact apply to the J&J vaccine. 44 students answered that the claim some people die immediately when receiving the COVID vaccine applied to the J&J vaccine. 12 students responded that the claim Bill Gates paid $1.4 billion to put microchips into the vaccine also applied to the J&J vaccine. And lastly, 21 students responded that they do not believe any of these claims and therefore none of them apply to the J&J vaccine. Lastly, our survey concluded with a question regarding which of the following claims do you believe? 24 adults ages 18 to 23 believe that the COVID-19 vaccine affects fertility. 8 adults believe some people die immediately when receiving the COVID vaccine. 8 adults believe Bill Gates paid $1.4 billion to put microchips into the vaccine. And lastly, 168 adults do not believe any of these claims. These numbers and data collected in unison with the data that 89% of respondents stated that they have consumed COVID-19 vaccine misinformation in one form or another point to an immense problem. One aspect of the problem is that adults ages 18 to 23 have and will continue to consume and potentially believe pieces of misinformation regarding the COVID-19 vaccine. The second aspect of the problem is that there's a clear disconnect between the quality of information that is being consumed by adults ages 18 to 23 and the quality of information that we, who are all here today, are consuming. This disconnect of the quality of information that is being consumed is growing and it must be addressed. So next steps, with the data regarding the COVID-19 vaccine misinformation in mind, there are next steps to be taken. For starters, it is essential that we within the scientific community acknowledge the magnitude of circulation of misinformation. By acknowledging the presence and potential threats of misinformation, we will be able to mitigate its effects within society and its effects on the science community. Secondly, I believe engaging the public and advocating for a universal understanding of science should be a priority for all scientists. To foster this deeper level of understanding for the general public, we as a community should implement campaigns to teach and explain science in a way that will foster the curiosity of people and the general public. Lastly, the survey is ongoing, and I will continue to analyze the findings as they develop. In conclusion, the rapid circulation of misinformation poses grave threats to the way we all consume information, and specifically to the successful vaccination of adults ages 18 to 23, as misinformation can result in vaccine hesitancy. Additionally, the hazards surrounding our consumption of information has already reached our political community and now our scientific community. And if we do not act swiftly to mitigate the effects of misinformation, it will soon pose a threat to every aspect of our global society. Last but not least, I would like to thank all the people and organizations that helped me gain the tools needed to perform the research presented to you today. Those organizations are Cybots Incorporated, Visionary Pharmaceuticals, the University of California, Berkeley School of Law's Human Rights Center, the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Research Lab, Amnesty International's Digital Verification Corps, and the hundreds of survey participants at universities across the country. Now I think we have a few minutes for questions if anyone has any.
Okay, so we do have a question in the chat. So why do you think some people are so ready to believe such misinformation and so slow to accept the results of scientific research?
So I think that people are so quick to kind of believe it. It goes back to the MIT study that, first of all, stories that are false are being circulated at such a higher rate that once someone reads something one time, let's say like the thing of Bill Gates paying $1.4 billion to put microchips in the vaccine. So you see it once and you think, that can't be true. But then you see it again, and then you see it again, and then you see it again. And people are like, well, it has to be real if everyone's talking about it and everyone keeps sharing it and you keep seeing it on your feed on Twitter or on Facebook or Instagram. So I think number one is repetition. That's kind of why people are so quick to believe it. And then to the second part of the question of why people are so slow to accept the results from the scientific side, like let's say like when these claims get debunked, I think it goes back to the disconnect. There's a disconnect of the information that people consume. So obviously we all sitting here today, we know and we believe scientific journals and the CDC, all these things, but you have to think that the people who are consuming these high levels of misinformation simply, they get their news from Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. So when they see those pieces of misinformation circulate on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, but then the CDC says it's not true, it's a disconnect of, well, I'm always looking on Twitter and Instagram, so why would I believe the CDC and all scientific journals and all that stuff? So again, I think it's a disconnect of where people are getting their information and who they choose to believe.
Thank you. We have another question. So is there any research on the best way to talk to people who believe this misinformation?
Yes, so there actually is a lot of research on that, and I can definitely follow up with some sources, but I think the biggest thing is you can't tell people it's not true, and just right off the bat, because there's a lot of pushback from that, and we've seen that a lot from, let's say, when you see social media platforms taking down pieces of misinformation or flagging things like you guys have all seen it on Twitter, Instagram, of that sort. But then you kind of go into the narrative of there's all these talks about if, let's say, social media platforms are marking things as misinformation, then people think, oh, well, they wouldn't mark it to be false if it wasn't true. If it wasn't true, then they wouldn't be trying to take it down. So it's this kind of spiraling, I don't know, you don't want to fuel into the conspiracy theories, but there is definitely a lot of research on how to speak to people that believe these things. And I mean, me personally, I think the best way is just to ask more questions, because really there's no facts to back it up that Bill Gates paid $1.4 billion to put microchips into the vaccine. So he goes, oh, really, where did you read that? Or, oh, wow, how much of a tax write-off do you get from that? Like stuff like that. I think it kind of just questioning the logic.
Well, thank you very much, Francesca. I don't see any more questions.